Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, partners, and friends. On behalf of the World Evangelical Alliance's United Nations New York Hub for Diplomacy and the Sustainable Development Goals, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's side event, Identifying Exploitation, the Gateway to Justice, taking place during the NGO CSW70 Forum. The World Evangelical Alliance is a global network representing more than 600 million evangelical Christians through 143 national alliances and hundreds of partner organizations working across every region of the world. Together, these alliances engage in humanitarian work, advocacy, and community development, seeking to contribute to human dignity, justice, and the flourishing of communities. One of the tragic realities we continue to confront globally is the exploitation and trafficking of women and girls. Too often, victims remain invisible, unrecognized by systems meant to protect them, and therefore unable to access justice or support. Strengthening how we identify exploitation is therefore not simply a technical issue, it is a gateway to protection, accountability, and ultimately freedom. Today's conversation brings together leaders from the World Freedom Network and regional freedom networks who are working on the front lines of addressing exploitation across Africa, Asia, Oceania, and beyond. Their experience reminds us that effective responses require collaboration across sectors, civil society, governments, faith communities, and international institutions. Before I hand over to our moderator, I would also like to mention that in addition to serving as the acting permanent representative for the WEA UN New York Hub, I steward the Middle East and North Africa anti-human trafficking work for the World Freedom Network through the RAIN Collective. I will look forward to joining the conversation later during the question and discussion section. It is now my pleasure to invite Jennifer Tunahag, the Global Director of the World Freedom Network, to introduce today's event and guide us into the discussion.
My name is Jennifer Romhild Tunahag, and I serve as the Global Director of the World Freedom Network, which is the anti-trafficking arm of the World Evangelical Alliance. The World Freedom Network is a global alliance of regional networks working to strengthen collaboration, to engage the church, and to advocate for change in the fight against human trafficking. One of the issues that we have begun to focus on is the need for victim identification. And that's because without identification, protection and justice cannot begin. So I want to start us off with the story of Maria. This story is a composite, but the experience that it reflects are very common to women and girls who are trafficked and exploited. Maria grew up in a difficult home. Her mother struggled with addiction, and the adults who moved in and out of the house brought with them instability and conflict. When Maria was 13, a man who was a friend of the family started helping out. He brought groceries to the house when there was no food. He would take her to school when things were in chaos. Sometimes he would even give her little small amounts of money. Um, to people around them, he looked like a supportive adult who was stepping up to help. But over time, the relationship changed. He began telling Maria that she owed him for his help. He told her that if she didn't do as he said, he could stop helping the family, or he could tell what he knew about her. And soon he was controlling where she went and the people that she saw. Sometimes he would take away her phone, but frequently he drove her to meet men in nearby towns, and he always kept the money that the men paid to have sex with Maria. Maria didn't think that she was being trafficked. She thought that she had made a mistake and was caught in the consequences of it. Over the next few years, Maria encountered numerous professionals who might have recognized what was happening. She went to a clinic with untreated symptoms and a clear infection. The doctor, while he treated the symptoms, he didn't follow up to ask questions that would have allowed him to understand her abuse. Police stopped her late at night with an older man And she was warned about making bad choices and told to go home. Eventually, a social worker became involved with when Maria ran away for a few days, but Maria wouldn't talk to her, and her risky behavior was attributed to problems at home. So each of these interactions with authority figures addressed part of the situation. These were people who saw part of what was happening, but no one identified the exploitation. And because Maria was never identified as a trafficking victim, her exploitation and abuse continued for years. The man who controlled her was never investigated, he was never stopped, and Maria wasn't protected, she wasn't supported, and she wasn't offered the help she was entitled to. Maria encountered the system many times, but the system never saw her. And because no one recognized the trafficking, justice for Maria never began. Freedom begins with being seen. Now, you all, if you are on this call, you probably know some of the statistics, some of the numbers around human exploitation and trafficking. Numbers like 27 million or 50 million people who are exploited in the world today. But I'll bet you don't know this number. 0.4%. 0.4%. The best global estimates suggest that fewer than one half of 1% of the people who are trafficked are formally identified each year. That means that 99% remain invisible to the systems that are designed to protect them. Women and girls like Maria. So the challenge we face today isn't just the vast scope of human exploitation and trafficking. It is the problem of failed identification. We're joined today by three experts who will bring us perspective from the global anti-trafficking movement. First, Helen Avadiar-Nimbacher, who leads the Asia Freedom Network. Helen is a trauma therapist, advocate, and strategist with more than 20 years of experience addressing gender-based violence and human trafficking. Helen is the founder of the Whispering Willow and Rise Foundation Asia, and she will help us understand what we mean when we talk about victim identification. Next, you'll hear from Peta Ann Small. Peta leads World Freedom Network Africa. She is South African herself and is the co-founder of the Set Free Foundation. Much of her work is involved walking alongside lived experience leaders, survivors whose resilience and leadership continue to shape how the movement responds to trafficking. Peta will give us a global overview of the issues that complicate identification and tell us what can help. And finally, Sarah Scott Webb. Sarah leads the Oceania Freedom Network and champions advocacy across the region. She's the global advocacy and network lead for SIM International and the co-founder of its global anti-trafficking ministry For Freedom. Sarah will take us through exploitation in different industries to help us shape a response. Panelists, welcome. Helen, you will begin.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're calling from. Thank you for the slides, Jennifer. I would like to start by asking a simple but very critical question for our workshop today. When we talk about responding to human trafficking, we often focus on many different parts of the system. We talk about prevention and protection. We talk about prosecution. We talk about migration governance, labor regulation, survivor services, and prevention strategies. If you're here today, you probably would have heard one of these things. But what makes any of those possible? The answer is victim identification. Without identification, none of the other parts of the system can function. But what does that really mean? If a victim is not recognized, they are not referred to protection, they cannot access legal support or specialized services, and the crime committed against them is far less likely to be investigated, unfortunately. So, victim identification is not simply one task within the whole anti trafficking response. It is actually the entry point to the entire system. And yet, globally, identification continues to be one of the weakest part of our response. Evidence from anti-trafficking responses around the world consistently show that many people who are trafficked interact with public systems multiple times, with police, healthcare providers, employers, border officials, or community organizations, without ever being recognized as victims of trafficking. In other words, many of these victims are not really hidden. They are visible, but they are not identified. They are not seen or recognized as someone who has been trafficked. To understand why this happens, we first need to understand what victim identification actually is. What is the broader picture? So, victim identification is often imagined as a single moment. When someone is rescued, when they finally speak about what is happening, or when authorities formally recognize them as a victim. But in reality, identification rarely happens that way. In practice, victim identification is a process. It's a series of interactions through which different practitioners, or at different points of contact for a victim, gradually recognize indicators, assess risk, and make decisions that shape what happens next. And because those encounters happen in many different places, identification often does not belong to a single agency. It is shared across an entire system. And this matters because identification is not only about protection. It determines whether crimes are investigated, whether trafficking patterns are understood, whether labor systems detect exploitation, whether migration governance respond appropriately, whether services actually reach the people they were designed for. When one part of the system does not recognize its role, identification breaks down, even when others are working well. So, to understand how this happens in practice, I have an example for you. Consider the following situation. A young woman agrees to marry a man who promises her a stable life and a work in another country. When she arrives in that country, the situation quickly changes for her. Her passport is taken for safekeeping. She's allowed to leave the house. She's not allowed to leave the house alone. She's physically and sexually abused, and she's required to work long hours in the family small business without any pay. She's told she owes money for the travel and marriage arrangements and cannot leave until the debt is repaid. Over time, she becomes increasingly isolated. She visits a clinic after repeated injuries of abuse. The doctor treats the injuries but assumes they are the result of domestic dispute. The neighbor occasionally sees her working long hours in the shop and notices she never speaks freely. And one evening, police are called after shouting is heard in the home. The situation, however, is treated as a family conflict between a married couple. What no one recognizes is that this is not simply a difficult marriage. It is trafficking. It involves deception, control of documents, debt, and forced labor. Each interaction addressed part of the situation, but no one connected the pieces. The woman was visible to multiple systems, but she was never identified as a victim of exploitation or trafficking. This example illustrates an important reality. Victim identification does not fail only when victims are hidden. It often fails when systems see individual problems but miss the pattern of exploitation behind them. And this is why we increasingly describe victim identification as an ecosystem. That's an important term that we'll hear a few times this morning or evening. Why is it important for us to understand that everyone is responsible? An ecosystem means that identification happens through the interaction of many different stakeholders. It involves law enforcement, labor inspectors, healthcare professionals, immigration officials, civil society organizations or NGOs, businesses, faith communities, and local communities themselves. Each of these point of contact or stakeholders encounter different moments along a trafficking journey. Identification might occur anytime during recruitment, during exploitation, or during escape, and sometimes years later when someone finally speaks about what happened. No single institution sees the entire picture. Very rarely does that happen. Each point of contact sees only part of it. But when those pieces connect through training, awareness, referral pathways, identification becomes possible. When they do not connect, victims can move through multiple systems without ever being recognized, and this has serious consequences. Today's session reframes identification not as a specialized task, but as a shared infrastructure within anti-trafficking responses. We are all responsible for a successful identification of someone as a victim of human trafficking. When trafficking is not identified, women and girls are often misclassified by the systems they encounter. They may be treated as undocumented migrants, offenders, or simply as individuals in difficult circumstances, or who have made poor choices. As a result, they may be detained, deported, or even criminalized, not because the exploitation did not exist, but because it was never identified. This is why improving victim identification is not only a technical challenge, it is a matter of justice. It requires systems that are capable of recognizing exploitation early, responding safely, and connecting the many stakeholders who encounter victims along the way. In the next part of this discussion, we will explore how these challenge appears across different regions, sectors, and systems. Because wherever each one of us sits, whether in government, civil society, business, or faith communities, we all hold part of the moment when someone moves from being invisible to being seen and ultimately to being recognized or identified as a victim of human trafficking. When identification fails, women and girls are often not only unprotected, they are excluded from justice systems entirely, sometimes criminalized instead of recognized. And justice can only begin when that moment of recognition occurs. I'll now pass it to Peter Ann, who will talk about what being seen looks like around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And good evening, good morning, hello, everyone. Sawubona, Jambo, Shalom, Karibu, Bonjour. As you've just heard, before protection can begin, before justice can move forward, someone must first be seen. Victim identification is not a single moment. It is an ecosystem shaped by every system people move through, be it border control, healthcare, labor systems, community networks, or humanitarian response. This ecosystem breaks down whenever any part of it fails to recognize what is right in front of them. For the next few minutes, we're going to take a quick world tour looking at 7 key regions. As we do so, we'll be focusing on 3 simple questions. Firstly, how exploitation shows up. Secondly, where identification systems break down. And thirdly, what one practical change could be that would make a difference. Globally, trafficking and exploitation may not look the same, but the justice gap is universal. Women and girls are hidden in plain sight, and identification is the doorway to their protection. Let's begin in Africa. Exploitation and trafficking in Africa often shows up along migration routes, in communities and in places shaped by conflict and vulnerability. Taking on many forms, they appear in forced marriage, sexual exploitation, sport recruitment, and across both formal and informal labor sectors. In many cases, trafficking begins with deceptive recruitment. People are approached with promises of education, jobs, or new opportunities. Existing identification systems in this region break down when women are treated as irregular migrants rather than potential victims, and when a fear of authorities and potential immigration consequences prevent many women from seeking help or reporting exploitation. One way to bring change in Africa would be to train community representatives, local organizations, and faith leaders to become safe referral points. Because in Africa, protection often begins in community. The first person to see exploitation is often not a border official, but more likely a neighbor or a community leader. Heading on fast to Asia, in Asia, exploitation is widespread, with victims often hidden in plain sight within labor and migration systems. Trafficking and exploitation are closely intertwined with large-scale labor migration systems, where women and men are exploited in sectors such as domestic work, construction and manufacturing, sexual exploitation, and increasingly in online scam compounds. Areas where existing identification systems break down in this region occur when many victims do not self-identify because of debt, coercion, fear, or even a lack of awareness as to their rights, when labor trafficking is missed or misidentified as undocumented migrants or offenders, and when exploitation remains hidden within recruitment networks, and corruption with limited access to safe reporting channels. One way to bring about change in Asia would be to strengthen survivor-safe identification and referral systems at borders and humanitarian touchpoints, equipping frontline stakeholders to recognize red flags and provide safe, trauma-informed pathways to protection. In Asia, exploitation often hides inside ordinary jobs, which means identification must begin where people work, travel, and seek help. In Europe, exploitation remains hidden within mixed migration flows and organized crime networks, particularly in cases of labor exploitation. Trafficking and exploitation are often confused with migrant smuggling and organized crime activity. In this region, existing identification systems break down when people are checking papers before people are seen. When systems check papers before they see people, victims disappear in plain sight. One way to bring change in Europe would be to strengthen the national referral mechanisms and involve civil society more, but earlier. In Latin America and the Caribbean, victims are often recognized, but not formally processed or protected, because trafficking and exploitation are often intra-regional, linked to migration corridors, sexual exploitation, and forced labor. In this region, existing identification systems break down when victims are recognized too late, when cross-border support is inconsistent, and when limited resources leave many in legal limbo. One way to bring about change in Latin America would be to strengthen local coordination efforts and to share regional toolkits, helping communities with early identification and connecting survivors to protection more quickly. In the MENA region, exploitation is often linked to conflict, displacement, refugee vulnerability, and labor exploitation, especially in domestic work. In this region, trafficking and exploitation frequently occur within migration and labor systems, when individuals seeking safety or economic opportunity become vulnerable to deception, coercion, and exploitation. Where existing identification systems break down in the MENA region depends on where the protection is built into crisis response and labor pathways, Many vulnerable people encounter humanitarian aid, migration, or employment systems long before they ever encounter help for exploitation or trafficking. One way to bring change to the MENA region would be to ensure protection starts where people already seek help, by embedding trafficking and exploitation identification into humanitarian aid systems, into labor protection, and into community referral networks. When conflict displaces people, protection must be able to travel with them. In Oceania, exploitation is increasing in labor trafficking, in domestic servitude, in forced marriage, and in sexual exploitation, with many of these intersecting with temporary migration systems, gender-based violence, and climate-related displacement, which heightens vulnerability across this region. In this region, low awareness and limited resources break down existing identification systems, and victims often avoid seeking help, particularly when protection is tied to police involvement or visa risk. When safety depends on immigration status, victims stay silent. One way to bring change to this region would be to support survivor-safe pathways that allow access to care and support without fear. In North America, exploitation and trafficking seldom announces itself, often appearing in ordinary places within everyday systems and industries. Existing identification systems break down in North America because labor trafficking is still frequently missed, survivors seldom self-disclose, and because being seen in this region often depends on what professionals are trained to notice. Many victims appear in everyday ecosystems such as healthcare, workplaces, child and youth protection services, and even hotline services. One way to bring change to this region would be to train and equip frontline professionals and communities to recognize red flags and to offer safe, trauma-informed referrals so that everyday spaces can become rescue or intervention points. When we say identification belongs to an ecosystem, we mean every one of us plays a role in helping to make identification either possible or missed. Across every region, trafficking and exploitation expertly adapt to regional situations and circumstances. The invitation, though, for each of us is the same. We need to learn to see, recognizing the indicators of exploitation in the spaces where we already work, respond early, acting at the first signs of concern and not waiting for legal certainty or full disclosure. And number 3 is to build pathways to protection, ensuring that when someone is identified, there is somewhere safe for them to go. When systems see status, behavior, or crime before they see the person, victims are missed everywhere. Justice begins the moment someone is finally seen, and every system we represent has the power to make that moment happen. We have seen how different trafficking appears across regions, but one reality remains constant. Identification is dependent on the systems people encounter. However, identification is not only shaped by geography, it's also shaped by the ecosystems people move through in everyday life. To help us explore how exploitation appears across different sectors and industries, I'll now hand over to Sarah Scott-Webb, who leads our Oceania Freedom Network, and she'll be bringing more information to this area. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Peter Ann. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Welcome to this session. And just a reminder, if you have any questions coming up that you would like to ask, do feel free to pop them in the chat and we will address these at the end. So we've heard today that victim identification is not a single moment, that it is a process and an ecosystem. And we've heard that justice begins that moment when someone is finally recognised for who they are. But this moment of recognition does not happen in theory. It happens in everyday decisions made across our different sectors. It happens when someone pauses, asks one more question, notices something that does not add up, or chooses to act on a concern. So the question before us today is not simply why identification matters. The question is, what does identification look like in practice, in government, in business, in civil society, and in faith communities? Because wherever each of us sits within this ecosystem, we help make identification either possible or missed. Let me briefly illustrate what this ecosystem looks like in real life. A young migrant woman arrives in a new country for work. Her passport is held by her employer. Her wages are delayed. She works excessive hours, but she does not describe herself as trafficked. She believes she is simply enduring hardship for her family. She visits a health clinic with chronic exhaustion. No one asks about her working conditions. Her employer passes a labour audit. The paperwork appears compliant. She attends a place of worship where she quietly asks for prayer because she feels overwhelmed and afraid, and no one recognises the indicators behind her fear. Months later, she is stopped by authorities for an immigration violation, and she's treated as non-compliant rather than potentially exploited. At every point, she was visible. She interacted with the very systems designed to protect her, and yet identification never happened. Not because no one cared, but because each point of contact saw only one piece of the story. Now imagine these same encounters differently. The health worker treating her exhaustion gently asks, "Are you free to leave your job if you want to?" The labour auditor looks beyond their paperwork and notices that her passport is not in her possession and that recruitment fees are being deducted from her wages. The faith leader, hearing her request for prayer, recognises fear rather than stress and knows who to call for advice. The immigration officer pauses before issuing a penalty and asks whether her documents are being withheld by someone else. And behind each of them, a referral pathway exists that allows concerns to be shared safely without immediately placing her at risk. Nothing dramatic changes except recognition. And recognition changes everything. Today on this Zoom, we represent government, business, civil society, and faith-based communities. Each sector encounters exploitation differently, but together we form the pathways through which someone moves from being invisible to being recognised. So let us look at how victim identification happens in practice, sector by sector. For governments, victim identification begins with system design. It begins with laws, policies, and institutions that make recognition possible. In practice, this means laws that allow for early identification, not only legal proof. It means frontline officials such as labour inspectors, police officers, immigration staff, healthcare workers, social services are trained to recognise indicators of exploitation and respond safely. It means clear referral pathways between agencies and sectors. And it means protection frameworks that do not punish victims for immigration status, unlawful work, or crimes committed under coercion. Government systems often ask, how do we find victims so that we can prosecute perpetrators? But a more powerful question is, are our systems recognizable and safe enough for victims to be identified within them? Because government's role in the ecosystem is not only to respond once trafficking is proven, it is to create the conditions that make identification possible in the first place. The private sector occupies a uniquely powerful position in the ecosystem because businesses often encounter exploitation earlier than anyone else through recruitment practices, subcontracting arrangements, labour supply chains, and workplaces. But victim identification here does not mean companies conducting investigations like law enforcement. It means creating environments where exploitation becomes visible instead of hidden. In practice, this means training managers and supervisors to recognize indicators such as wage withholding, document control, restricted movement, or recruitment debt. It means ensuring responsible recruitment practices that reduce vulnerability before exploitation begins. It means worker grievance mechanisms that are safe, accessible, and trusted. And it means partnerships with NGOs when concerns arise, recognizing that businesses are really the right actors to respond alone. Too often in the private sector, compliance focuses only on audits and documentation. But exploitation doesn't fit neatly on a checklist. Identification improves when companies shift from asking, are we compliant, to asking, are our workers safe enough to be heard? And when businesses embrace this role, supply chains can actually become early warning systems, making it possible for us to recognize exploitation long before it reaches crisis point. NGOs and civil society organizations are often where identification becomes real. Why? Because identification depends on trust, and trust often exists outside of formal authority. NGOs encounter people who may never disclose exploitation through a government system. Migrant workers, women in informal economies, individuals navigating housing, healthcare, or legal uncertainty. In practice, identification here means learning to recognize patterns across cases. It means creating safe spaces where disclosure can happen gradually. And it means making preliminary assessments without requiring someone to first self-identify as trafficked. It also means acting as a bridge between informal recognition and formal protection systems. NGOs often ask, how do we support victims once they've been identified? But a more powerful question is, are we creating the trust and conditions that allow exploitation to be recognized before someone ever enters a formal system? In many countries, it is civil society who sees exploitation first, but they often do not have the authority to formalize identification. And this is where ecosystem thinking becomes essential. One example is in Italy, where government is not the only sector authorized to identify victims of trafficking. Certified NGOs can also make formal identifications, immediately connecting victims to protection and to services to help. It is a powerful recognition that civil society is not just supporting the ecosystem, it is a vital part of how identification happens. And the key here is that when NGO insight is treated not as anecdotal, but treated as critical intelligence within national responses, identification becomes possible because many victims are not first identified through raids or investigations. They are identified through relationships. And faith-based organisations, they play a distinctive and often underestimated role within the identification ecosystem. Across regions, faith communities are embedded in our daily life through places of worship, community outreach, migrant support networks, shelters, and humanitarian work. They are often trusted long before formal institutions are. In practice, identification here means recognising signs of exploitation during pastoral care or community engagement. It means creating non-judgmental spaces where people feel seen and heard rather than assessed or judged. It means knowing when and how to safely refer to specialised services. And it means challenging the stigma that can prevent women and girls from being recognised as victims of trafficking and exploitation. Faith communities often ask, how can we care for people in crisis in our communities? But the more powerful question is, are we equipped to recognise when suffering, fear, or family violence may actually be indicators of exploitation? You see, faith communities are really formal identifiers, but they are often the first witnesses. Their role is not to investigate. It is to notice, to listen, to connect, to support. And in many contexts, it is that moment of compassionate recognition that becomes the first step towards safety and toward justice. When we bring this whole ecosystem together, what becomes clear across all sectors is this: victim identification does not depend on one perfect point of contact or one perfect system. It depends on alignment between many imperfect ones. A labour inspector may notice indicators. An NGO may build trust. A business may raise concerns. A faith leader may hear a disclosure. Each action alone is incomplete, but together they help create identification. And understanding this changes how we understand responsibility, because the responsibility for improving victim identification does not sit with one sector alone. It belongs to all of us across governments, businesses, civil society, and faith communities, each recognising the vital role we play within the identification ecosystem. We've heard across regions, victims are often not hidden. They are interacting in our workplaces, our services, our communities, and our institutions every day. People like the woman we imagined earlier, moving through systems designed to protect her, yet she was never recognised. Why? Victim identification does not fail just because systems lack resources. It fails when we underestimate the role our own sectors and our own institutions can play in recognising exploitation. Friends, the question before us is not whether better identification is possible. The question is whether our systems and our sectors are ready to recognize what is already in front of us and to play our part in the ecosystem to make identification possible. Thank you. Jennifer, I'll return to you.
Friends, thank you for that excellent panel. We are looking forward to taking some time for questions from our audience now. So give me just a moment while we make sure all of our speakers are spotlit here and you can see everyone on your screen. Well, that is very exciting. That is not what this is meant to do. All right. All right. So the chat is open. We are looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts. We are joined again by Dr. Jason Pope, who leads the coalition in the MENA region. So we have good representation here globally. We are certainly ready to hear your questions. And I suppose for you all, I have at least one question. You may not all wish to answer it, but what would you like people to do as a result of our session today? You know, we have this opportunity at the Commission on the Status of Women. What would your hope be for the people who are watching online?
I'll start. I think my hope would be that I would encourage us all, and I'll include us in this as well, to be reflecting on what is our place in the ecosystem. Where do we sit? Where are our circles of influence? And to be looking at that and then looking at, well, how can we be stepping into our part of the ecosystem better? Like, what is it that I as a civil society organization might need to do? What is it that I as a faith-based community might need to do? What is it that I might need to do as a business owner or something like that? Because I think there is, you know, we can't do everything, but I think there is a really strong opportunity here for us to really just be reflecting on what are our institutions and where we can step up and perhaps start to identify indicators of exploitation. It may be perhaps to actually, well, in my town, where are some organizations who are working in the anti-trafficking field that I could refer to, who is someone I could get to come and do some training in my organization? So to be thinking about your place in the ecosystem and where you can start to get some upskilling and awareness in your context.
Thank you, Sarah. Any of the other panelists like to answer that? We do have some more questions coming into the chat, so you don't need to if you don't want to. Helen.
I think I would like to see how we can shift from just reactive identification to more proactive identification, because victims rarely self-identify, right? They sometimes they don't know whether they are victims themselves. So for us to be able to understand, the trauma-informed screening tools, Palermo protocols, or all those, for some of us, these terms might seem foreign, but for us to be able to educate ourselves to know what is it, who is a victim, who is a survivor, what are the rules and laws and policies that might be in my ecosystem, in my space. How can I strengthen identification systems within my own institution? I think those things are important. So if we learn how to recognize patterns of coercion or control or exploitation, rather than waiting for the victim to disclose it, if we make the effort to actually educate ourselves on what those things look like, I think we're already one step ahead.
Fantastic. That actually ties really well into Lily's question here in the chat. Lily says, and so we might want to expand on this. What if the victim themselves fail to recognize that they are being exploited? They could believe that it is a cultural or a religious or a social norm. So, what strategies might work in this situation? Someone we believe is being exploited and they are uncertain.
Yeah.
Jason, looks like you'd like to speak with that. To that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize people's dignity in terms of we all have a right to choose our identity and to identify, as a victim or not identify as a victim, it should be that own person's right to be able to identify in certain ways. On the other side of things, and actually, it's not even another side. In a different way, there are some very tangible criteria for being a victim of human trafficking. If you're an adult, that includes that there is some type of exploitation, which seems very silly, but it means that someone profits off of what takes place. If you're an adult, it means that there's been force, fraud, or coercion involved in the case, and it also means that some type of activity is taking place. Someone kidnapped, someone harbored you. There was some type of action. Those three things that make up human trafficking. And if people tell a story about their life and they include those three elements, then in a technical sense, they have met the criteria that meets the conditions of the Palermo Protocol, where that is laid out, or if you're in the United States, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that qualifies them for support.
Mhm.
Um, and in addition, it provides data for trafficking organizations to be able to operate and know how many people are actually facing this, which in turn provides funding, which in turn provides activities, which in turn helps stop human trafficking. So it's really important on one side to make sure that dignity is preserved and that person is given full rights over how they identify, whether it's a victim or not a victim. On a different side, on a technical side, it's important to note when conditions are met for human trafficking, and those two things can coexist.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. Thank
Can I
you.
just add one thing to that?
Certainly.
I think for us to focus on the indicators and not the self-identification, because things like restriction of movement, withholding of wages, when someone is feeling like they're coerced or they're staying because of manipulation or threat. So when we start recognizing those things, it's not culturally in some of the places that some of us work, those things are embedded culturally. But for
Mhm.
us to understand, are they safe? And to be able to build that trust enough to ask simple questions. Are you able to leave work when you want to? Who controls your wages and document? What happens if you refuse to leave work? What are those bruises that I see? Would you like to talk more about it? Those simple things can actually help us build that trust for them to be able to disclose what they're going through. It's not necessarily about defining whether they're victims of exploitation or trafficking or not, but whether they're safe or not and what help that they would need for that
Mm.
space.
Fabulous. Thank you. Peter, did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the trust element. I think that's a really key component with victims to empower them to self-identify.
Mm.
It has to come down to a trust in the relationship. I think what Dr. Jason spoke about is the element of dignity is really key in this context, and we need to make sure that it is a choice that they have. But they also need to be empowered and equipped with the understanding and knowledge of what it means if you are classified as a victim, because the two channels that you go through are completely different.
Mm.
And if you can choose to go through that I'm not a victim, and this is the channel that you're going to go through. And if that's your choice, that's your right. But if you know what the right is, what the right channel is in terms of choosing the other channel, you get better care and better support along the way.
Thank you. Brilliant, friends. Let's move on to a question from Anissa in the chat. She says, from a Christian standpoint, what do we want to see more of from the church when it comes to combating sexual exploitation and trafficking, both at the local level and beyond? And I would love to just speak to that briefly. I think that there are, in my opinion, and I anticipate that the rest of you are going to chime in here too. But in my opinion, that there are two key things that I think the church needs to understand. It's vulnerability and who is vulnerable in our communities. We've already sort of pointed to this. I am always, or I'm often talking with church congregations and leaders and saying, so perpetrators, predators can see signs that individuals are vulnerable. They know what they're looking at, so that they can spring on their prey. And that's, of course, very bad news. But the good news is that we, as the church, as people in community, are also able to understand what we're seeing. We are able to learn those indicators that people are vulnerable and then to step in to create layers of protection around those people. So I think understanding vulnerability, who in your community is vulnerable, is key. I think also, actually, churches need to be places of welcome and safety. Because I think for those of us who work on the ground with people who are vulnerable, uh, church is not always actually a safe place for people who are vulnerable and hurting. And so our churches need to take steps to become places of safety and places of welcome for people with trauma, for people who have had experienced abuse or exploitation. And that's a journey, but that's one that we are actually quite excited in the World Freedom Network to take together with churches. So, is there anyone else who would like to respond to that, Jason?
Yeah. So I'd like to see the church know and understand human trafficking, what it is in all of its forms, and understanding that definition that we went through on the last question, anything that meets that requirement, whether it's organ trafficking, whether it's child trafficking, online exploitation. There's so many different faces of human trafficking. Um, and that hasn't led. If you can be the reason I'm interested in the church really understanding what human trafficking is because while human trafficking has been uh, a bipartisan issue, meaning both parties have in the US have at times championed anti-human trafficking programs and policies, um, that the political dynamics have made waves back and forth between supporting labor trafficking as the biggest need or sex trafficking as the biggest need. Um, and it's all about borders and migration. There's these political hotspots that seem to try to grab the church and pull them in different directions. And I think that I really long for the church to be grounded in what the definition of human trafficking is and stand on that and say, you know what, like, I don't care if it's somebody who's crossing a border or somebody who never leaves their house. Like if somebody else is taking control over them to make money and basically commodified them to themselves, it's wrong. And I won't stand for it. And this is not a political issue. This is a spiritual issue.
Can I just echo and support both what Jennifer and Jason have been saying? And just to pick up on what Jennifer was talking about, the need for the church to be welcoming to all, especially those who are marginalised in our communities, but also the need for churches to understand vulnerability. And I mean, protecting the vulnerable is one of the core mandates of Christian faith. It's something we're called to do. But I think just to add on to that as well, when Jennifer was talking about protective layers, I think often the church as well doesn't fully understand that actually one of the biggest vulnerability factors for someone to be exploited or trafficked is they lack that sort of protective, supportive relationship or network. And that should be the church, like we should be that place of support and protection, just simply stepping into that sort of relational part of what we need to do. Like we might have a youth group that does football or soccer with a group of local kids, totally not even understanding that because they're connecting with these really vulnerable kids and building relationships of trust, that they're actually keeping these kids safe. They're building a layer of protection around them. So I think there's all that kind of nuance to really step into. But the other thing that I do get a little bit passionate about when it comes to the church is that I feel we are too quiet and we're too scared to step into our role as advocates for those who are marginalised and those who are vulnerable and those who are being trafficked. And I know we're all in different countries and it might be more tricky politically in some places or other, but as the church, we have a voice and we need to step up and use that voice to protect the vulnerable, to free the oppressed, to set the captives free. So what I would love to see the church do is really step into its role as in advocacy, whatever that might look like in your local community, your country community, or globally.
As you can see, we're pretty passionate about this. We do have some more
Sorry,
questions.
one more thing, just
Sure.
very quickly. I think that churches should also be open to collaboration beyond the church.
Yes.
Because as we talked about, it's a big ecosystem. So while we, equip ourselves and really know what to do, effective responses does involve government and NGOs and law enforcement, survivor organizations. So the church should actually be able to do cross-sector work, be able to step out and make those relationships stronger and be the voice of the community in that sense as well. And that comes from expertise. We can't go into a government office and say, hey, I want to do something about human trafficking, but not know what it is at all. So become experts in the field and then take it out to the other sectors so that they recognize that the church is not just about faith, spirituality, and evangelism, but much more than that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Helen. We had a question which has disappeared now around the use of technology in victim identification. So Luna Sophia asks, how can technology be used to improve the identification of trafficking victims while still protecting their privacy and safety? Great question. Are you seeing that in any of your regions? Technology being used to aid in identification? Helen?
I think organizations like UNODC, IOM, International Organizations for Migration, United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, they are putting into place really strong data protection frameworks. So I think a lot of NGOs, a lot of tech companies, especially in the Asia region, because of the cyber scam and transnational organized crime. So I think it's improving. We're trying to see how we can not just strengthen protection systems, but also strengthen victim identification systems, have better database, have better mapping on how to really be able to track and identify victims. But I don't think we're there yet. We're still needing, collaboration from different sectors to come on board. Everyone wants to protect their system, but they don't understand that the system will be better protected if collaboration across sectors happen. There's lots of, strong encryptions, restricted access controls, anonymized coded personal data. All these things come into play, and every sector has their own protection system. So it for me, from what we see in Asia, it's rising. Everyone wants to be on board, but nobody but wants to collaborate yet. But we're taking there. We're getting there. There is a lot of technology support for frontline identification, which means that NGOs are starting to have a lot of traction and a lot of power to be able to put data protection in place for survivors that come when it comes to case management. But we are still, I think there's still like 30-40% of advancements, long way to go.
And yet I'd also say your region's probably one of the more advanced regions compared to some of the other places.
Yeah, because of the need.
I will say that the International Office for NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the US, their international office in London has victim identification as one of its top things. And the new CEO of that international office is a tech person. So I think and hope that we can expect to see some progress from them. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is that in our sector, we believe strongly a win for anybody is a win for everybody. We really want to see these other organizations go, like develop amazing tools that can be spread across the sector, across the movement. So we're excited to see what else will happen. And there is definitely a need for more to happen in this space. Are we okay to move on to a next question, panel? All right. Cami asks, do legal definitions of trafficking in intimate partner relationships differ from how we would define or identify trafficking in these circumstances? Boy, that is a tough question, isn't it? Intimate partner exploitation often seems to be dismissed as intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Is there a way to shift how these cases are recognized within the legal system? And Cami is saying that she's in the US, but she'd love to hear what other countries are doing on this. So the challenges of identifying when this is an intimate partner exploitation.
Yeah, I can briefly say from a country in the Middle East that I'm working with, they have a human trafficking law on the books, but it's not really well known, and it's not known by judges. It's not known by police officers. Lawyers rarely use it, and so I mean, in human trafficking, there's a lot of overlapping crimes that take place, and sometimes human trafficking is not the easiest crime to get a conviction on. And so there are a lot of times where other crimes end up being the case. In this country, we are beginning to work on that issue by holding symposiums with lawyers and police officers and training on the law itself and its use, and hopefully by elevating its status, it will get implemented more and used more in that context.
Brilliant. Any other thoughts from other world regions around identifying exploitation that happens in intimate partner or domestic situations?
So I think the legal frameworks and case law in some countries have not fully evolved to recognize trafficking within intimate relationships. Investigators and prosecutors may be more familiar with domestic violence frameworks than trafficking frameworks. There's a huge overlap, and victims themselves may identify the person exploiting them as partner rather than a trafficker in a lot of ways, which can complicate reporting and prosecution. The dynamics of this, especially when it comes to coercive control or trauma bonding, economic dependency can mask exploitation. So there is a lot of research being done by, again, UNODC or international and ILO, International Labour Organizations, to note that trafficking frequently involves abuse of vulnerable and coercive relationships, and it's not just only organized crime, but there isn't any legal standing for it. We do need to expand training for investigators and prosecutors, but sometimes the case gets overwhelming that they are happy to pass it on as domestic violence or intimate partner violence, because within trafficking, there's going to be most probably intimate partner violence or domestic violence. That means there is going to be physical and sexual violence, but those who are going through those violence might not see themselves or report themselves or claim to be. So if the victim themselves don't say, yes, I'm being trafficked, then there's a lot of, it is case closed. So recognizing that, I think it's there's still some ways to go on creating that clear overlap.
Just to add to that, I think the recent case with Giselle Pellicot in France was an example of that. I think originally she was dismissed as a domestic violence case or an intimate partner violence case, and it was just sort of thrown out. And it took her standing up and saying no, no, no,
Wow.
and eventually finding a lawyer who would respond to her before she got to court. Sorry,
Great
couldn't think of
point.
the word. Sorry.
Great point. All right. Oh, we have new people still joining us. We're getting ready to wrap up. Anna has a great question for us. She says, are there any virtual trainings that you guys provide for our communities to learn about victim identification? So
I would just like to jump in and say, we don't have any planned at the moment, but I think we will be doing some and rolling that out. So I've just popped in the chat a way to keep in touch with us. There's an email you can email and we'll pick that up, or go to our website and join up. And then when we are releasing trainings and more information on victim identification, we can let you know with that.
Thank you, Sarah.
But
Yeah,
specifically World Freedom Network stuff. Yeah.
I would absolutely encourage you all. If you are interested in training on this, please do get in touch with us. And depending on your region and your interest, we may be able to match you with existing materials, or we may be able to do something specifically with you. So please do reach out if you're interested in training. All right, Cami, thank you for adding your details here. If anyone else on the chat would like to share their details, we'd be happy to send those out in a follow-up email to everyone. If you are happy for your email or your organization to be shared as a follow-up to this, go ahead and please put that in the chat. We're very happy to do that for you. It is just about time for us to wrap up. So this is a last opportunity to ask questions. And I suppose I'm wondering, we are certainly hoping that we have created interest for you to take action. If there is an action that you were thinking about, is there anything that you still need to know or you'd like to hear from us so that you are able to actually move on the things that you've heard today? Well, you have our contact information. We are happy to continue to respond to your questions. Thank you very much for joining us for the session today. Karen has asked, how do we get a recording of the session? We will send a link to you in a follow-up email. It will probably come to you next week. So you will be able to see this again, and you will also send you then links to the website and our email address so that you can send questions through to us.
We'll also be putting the recording up on our website as well.
Yeah. Thanks to our panelists, to those who spoke. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a good evening.